Hey guys! Tonight we trudge into the bone-chilling world of a medieval European village, where winter clamps down like an iron vice, and peasants somehow survive without fire or proper warmth. Picture yourself on a snow-dusted path, your breath puffing in the frosty air, as ramshackle huts huddle against a gray sky. The wind bites your cheeks, and inside those flimsy walls, families shiver, their world a battle against the cold. How do they make it through? You're about to find out. But fair warning, surviving a medieval winter with just rags and grit might be tougher than you think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a village in 1350, somewhere in England's muddy heartland, where winter's arrived with a vengeance. Snow dusts the fields, and the air smells of damp earth and faint wood smoke from the Lord's manor. Not your hut, though. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasants faced brutal winters in homes, barely better than sheds, with no central heating, scarce firewood, and thin clothing. They relied on ingenuity, community, and sheer stubbornness to endure months of frost. Your hut's walls are waterland daub, a weave of sticks and mud that lets in drafts like an open window. You shiver, wrapping your arms around yourself, and notice your neighbors, a family of 5, huddled on a straw pallet. They're not lighting a fire, fuel's too precious, and the risk of burning down their homes too high. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed sleeping near their pigs could ward off winter spirits, thinking the animal's warmth carried a kind of earthy magic. You glance at a pig snuffling in the corner and raise an eyebrow. Magic or not, it's just smelly. Historians still argue whether peasants' winter survival was more about practical tricks or desperate superstition, a way to cope with a season that could kill. You're leaning toward practicality. That pig's body heat might actually help. You step closer to the family, their faces pale but determined, and feel the weight of their reality. No thermostats, no electric blankets, just raw endurance. Joke number 1. If you think your WIF's spotty, try keeping warm with a pig and a prayer. The village outside is quiet, save for the wind's low howl and the crunch of footsteps in the snow. You notice a faint glow from the church, where some seek solace, but most are in huts like this, pooling what little they have. You're starting to see how survival here is a group effort, not a solo act. The family's eldest, a girl named Alice, offers you a tattered cloak to wrap around your shoulders. It's scratchy, barely warm, but you're grateful. You think of modern winters, with hot cocoa and Netflix, and almost laugh. This is a different beast. Joke number 2. If medieval peasants had Yelp, they'd give winter 1 star for ambience. But too much frostbite. The hut's chill seeps into your bones. But there's a story in every shiver, and you're ready to dig deeper. You're still in Alice's cramped hut, the air biting with a chill that sneaks through the waterland daub walls. The faint snuffle of the pig in the corner your only company, besides the family's shallow breaths. The tattered cloak Alice gave you is about as warm as a paper towel, but you're here to explore these flimsy peasant homes, barely a shield against winter's wrath. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasant huts were simple, often one-room structures with mud walls, thatched roofs, and dirt floors that turned to slush in winter. They offered little insulation, and without regular fires, firewood was scarce and risky. These homes were iceboxes. You huddle closer to the family's straw pallet, feeling the cold seep through your boots, and notice cracks in the walls where snow dust sifts in. Like unwanted guests, the hut creaks under the wind's assault, and you're wondering how anyone sleeps without turning into a popsicle. You run your hand along the wall, its rough mud surface crumbling under your fingers. The thatch above drips when it thaws, leaving puddles on the floor. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants stuffed rags or dried moss into wall gaps, believing it trapped the cold like a charm against spirits. You imagine alleys jamming moss into cracks and muttering prayers, and you smirk. Charm or not, it's a draft stopper. Historians still argue whether these huts were deliberately basic to prioritize survival tasks or just the best peasants could manage with limited resources. You're leaning toward necessity. The Lord's manor has stone walls and roaring hearts, but here, it's sticks and hope. You poke at the thatch, and a clump falls, dusting your cloak with straw. Great, now you're accessorizing with roof. The family's pallet is a tangle of limbs, everyone curled tight to share warmth. You notice a wooden bucket by the door, half filled with snowmelt for drinking. Fetching water in this cold is no joke. You think back to the pig, its so-called spirit warding warmth from the last hut visit, and wonder if it's the only thing keeping this place bearable. The hut's not just a shelter, it's a test, forcing ingenuity from scraps. You try sitting on the pallet, but the straw's damp, and you're up fast, your backside frozen. Alice catches your grimace and shrugs. She's used to it. You're starting to see why survival here means embracing discomfort like an old friend. Joke number 1. If this hut was on Airbnb, it'd be listed as cozy with a side of hypothermia. Outside, the village is a ghost town, snow piling against other huts that look just as flimsy. You imagine the manor's warmth, its firelight mocking these shivering families. The stakes are high. A bad storm could collapse a roof, and there's no medieval FEMA to call. You think of modern apartments with radiators hissing, and almost laugh. This is raw, unfiltered survival. Alice's mother, Edith, stirs, wrapping a rag around her hands to keep frostbite at bay. You're impressed by their grit but also daunted. Every day's a gamble with the cold. Joke number 2. If peasants had social media, they'd post #wintervibes with a shivering selfie and 0 likes. The hut's chill wraps around you, but there's a story in its cracks, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's frigid hut, the air so cold your breath hangs like a ghost. The straw pallet and snoring pig offering 0 comfort against the creeping frost. The tattered cloak from Alice is doing nothing, and you're here to wrap yourself in the threadbare clothes medieval peasants used to fend off winter's bite. Mainstream history tells us peasants wore simple, layered garments, wool tunics, linen shifts, and cloaks if they were lucky, but these were often patched, thin, and barely warm enough for fall, let alone a brutal winter. You're tugging on a scratchy wool tunic Edith hands you. Its holes patched with mismatched scraps, and it smells like damp sheep. Your fingers fumble with a rope belt, the cold making them clumsy, and you're already dreaming of a modern puffer jacket. The hut's walls whistle with drafts, and you're wondering how these rags are supposed to keep you from freezing solid. You layer a second tunic, this one linen and so worn it's practically see-through, followed by a cloak that's more holes than fabric. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants rubbed their clothes with goose fat, believing it made them windproof, like a medieval DIY waterproofing hack. You imagine slathering your tunic with grease and when smelly, but maybe effective. Historians still argue whether layering was a deliberate strategy or just desperation, piling on every scrap to trap heat. You're leaning toward desperation. This cloak's about as insulating as a paper bag. You wrap it tighter, but the wind sneaks through, chilling your bones. Alice, in her own patched tunic, looks unfazed, her hands red but steady as she mends a sleeve with a bone needle. You stomp your feet to keep the blood moving, noticing your boots' leather scraps tied with twine are letting in snow. Peasants couldn't afford the lord's fur-lined gear, so they made do with whatever they had, often passing clothes down until they disintegrated. You think back to the hut's moss-stuffed cracks, another scrappy survival trick, and see a pattern. Everything here is cobbled together, from walls to wardrobes. You try walking, but the layers weigh you down, and you nearly trip over the cloak's frayed hem. Alice smirks, and you're starting to get why peasants moved slowly in winter fashion's not the issue. Survival is. Joke number 1. If this outfit was on a runway, it'd be dubbed chic frostbite couture. You glance at Edith, who's wrapping her head in a linen coif to keep her ears from freezing. The stakes are high. Poor clothing could mean frostbite or worse, and there's no medieval urgent care. You imagine the manor's lord in his velvet robes, probably toasting his toes by a fire, while you're here playing dress-up with rags. The family's resilience is humbling, but you're not loving the itch of this wool. You think of modern winter gear Gore-Tex, anyone, and almost laugh. Joke number 2. If peasants had Amazon, they'd one day ship a space heater and call it a day. The hut's chill is relentless, but there's a story in every patch, and you're ready to trudge on. You're still in Alice's icy hut, the threadbare tunic and holy cloak doing little to stop the cold that's settled into your bones. The pigs snuffling, now a faint background hum. Your boots are damp from snowmelt, and you're here to scavenge in frozen fields, where medieval peasants foraged for scarce food to survive winter's famine. Mainstream history tells us winter was a lean season for peasants, with harvests long gone and stored grain dwindling, forcing them to scrape together anything edible, roots, bark, even frozen weeds to stretch their supplies. You're trudging out the hut's door, following Alice into a snow-crusted field, the wind stinging your face like 1,000 tiny needles. The ground's hard as iron, and you're clutching a wicker basket, hoping to find something that won't break your teeth. You kneel beside Alice, scraping at the dirt with a stick, unearthing a shriveled turnip half frozen in the soil. It's pitiful, but she tucks it into her basket like it's gold. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants chewed pine needles, believing they warmed the blood and eased hunger pangs. A medieval energy shot that probably tasted like despair. You imagine gnawing a pine branch and wince pass. Historians still argue whether foraging was a skilled art or a desperate gamble, with some saying peasants knew secret edible plants, while others think they ate anything that didn't kill them outright. You're leaning toward desperation. This turnip looks like it's been through a bad divorce. You dig again, finding a frozen nettle, and Alice nods your learning, but your fingers are numb. The field stretches out, a white wasteland dotted with skeletal trees, no lord's pantry in sight. You think back to the hut's flimsy walls, how they barely kept out the cold, and now you're out here, where starvation's as real a threat as frostbite. Alice points to a patch of frostbitten kale, its leaves brittle but edible if boiled. You're impressed by her knack for spotting food where you see only snow, but it's grim work. Every root's a fight with the frozen earth. You recall the pig, maybe warmer than you right now, and wonder if it's eating better. The stakes are high. A bad forage means empty bellies, and winter doesn't forgive. You stuff a nettle in the basket, your hands stinging, and feel the weight of their daily grind. You trudge back toward the hut, the basket half empty, your breath clouding the air. Alice's face is set. No complaints, just focus. You think of modern grocery stores with their endless aisles and almost laugh. This is survival shopping. Medieval style. You're starting to see why every scrap matters. Why peasants clung to every turnip like a lifeline. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent. Like raiding a dumpster for expired yogurt and calling it gourmet. Joke number 1. If peasants had food blogs, they'd rate frozen nettles 5 stars for not dying. The village looms ahead, its huts barely visible through the snow. You're heading to communal sleeping next, where body heat becomes a currency. The basket's weight lingers, Alice's steps crunch on, and you move forward. The ear's hunger guiding you. The more you dig, the clearer it becomes. Winter wasn't just cold, it was a fight for every bite. Let's keep drifting. You're back in Alice's freezing hut. The meager basket of frozen turnips and nettles from the field now dumped in a corner. The pigs snuffling, a faint reminder of the warmth you're craving. Your threadbare tunic itches, and you're here to join the peasants piling together to share body heat. A desperate bid to survive winter's relentless cold. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasants often slept communally in winter, cramming entire families, sometimes neighbors, onto a single straw pallet to pull warmth. Since fires were rare and huts barely insulated, you're scooting onto the family's pallet, a lumpy mess of straw and rags, squeezing between Alice and her little brother, Tom, who smells like dirt and onions. The air's thick with the musty scent of unwashed bodies, but it's warmer here, a human furnace against the frost creeping through the walls. You pull your cloak tight, feeling Tom's bony elbow jab your side as he shifts. The palais's packed Alice's parents, Edith and John, plus 2 younger siblings, all tangled like a litter of puppies. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed communal sleeping kept away winter demons, thinking shared breath warded off evil spirits. You glance at the pig, still snuffling in its corner, and wonder if it's the real demon repellent. Historians still argue whether communal sleeping was purely practical or tied to superstition, a way to make sense of a brutal season. You're leaning toward practical. The heat from Alice's shoulder is the only thing keeping your teeth from chattering. You try to settle, but the straw pokes through your tunic, and Tom's snoring is louder than a sawmill. You think back to the frozen field, where every turnip was a victory, and realize this palais's another kind of fight against the cold that could kill by dawn. The hut's walls, those flimsy Waterland daub sieves, let in drafts that swirl around your feet. You're impressed by the family's quiet endurance. No one complaining about the cramped quarters or the smell. It's survival, plain and simple, and you're part of it, for better or worse. You recall the Lord's manor, probably toasty with roaring fires, and feel a twinge of envy. You shift, trying not to crush Alice, and wonder how anyone sleeps like this without dreaming of thermostats. Joke number 1. If communal sleeping was an Olympic sport, peasants would win gold for most creative cuddling. The stakes are high. Without this shared warmth, frostbite or worse could claim anyone by morning. You notice Edith tucking a rag around Tom's feet, her hands moving with practiced care. The family's closeness isn't just physical, it's a bond forged by necessity, a human shield against winter. You think of modern creature comforts, electric blankets, hot showers, and almost laugh. This is raw, no frills survival. You're starting to see why they pile in like this, why every warm body counts. You smirk, imagining a modern equivalent, like cramming your whole office into a blanket fort during a blackout. Joke number 2. If peasants had Instagram, they'd caption this pallet pile #squad goals, but make it freezing. The hut's chill lingers, but the palais's warmth is a faint comfort, and you're ready to keep going. You're still crammed on Alice's straw pallet. The faint warmth of her family's bodies a thin shield against the hut's icy air. The pigs snuffling now a distant drone beneath the wind's howl outside. Your tunic stamped from the palais, musty straw, and you're here to learn why peasants rarely lit warming fires, despite the bone-chilling cold of a medieval winter. Mainstream history tells us that firewood was scarce for peasants, tightly controlled by lords who owned the forests, and the risk of fire in flimsy, thatched huts made even small hearths dangerous. You're eyeing the hut's central hearth, a shallow pit of cold ash, no glow to tempt you from the palais's crowded heat. The air smells of damp earth and sour straw, and you're shivering as you imagine a fire's warmth. But Alice shakes her head, lighting one's not worth the cost or the gamble. You crawl off the pallet, your knees creaking, and kneel by the hearth. A few charred sticks lie scattered, barely enough for a flicker. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants burn dried dung when wood ran out, believing its smoky stench kept frost spirits at bay. You sniff the air, half expecting that rank odor, and grimace spas on the dung bonfire. Historians still argue whether avoiding fires was purely practical or partly fear-driven, with some saying peasants dreaded accidental blazes, while others think superstitions about fire-hungry spirits played a role. You're leaning toward practical. One spark could torch this hut, leaving Alice's family homeless in the snow. You poke the ash with a stick, and Edith, watching from the pallet, mutters about the Lord's men finding anyone caught poaching wood. You think back to the frozen field, where every turnip was a hard-won prize, and realize firewood's another resource out of reach. The Lord's manor, with its roaring hearths, feels like a cruel taunt, while here, the hearth's just a decoration. You're starting to see why the family huddles on that pallet, cooling body heat instead of risking a fire. You try imagining a blaze, but the thatch above looks like a tinderbox, and you're not keen on testing it. Alice's brother Tom stirs, his breath clouding, and you wonder how they endure this without dreaming of matches and kindling. Joke number 1. If this hearth was on a dating app, it'd be ghosted for no spark to cold. The stakes are high. A fire could warm the hut but also burn it down, and wood so scarce you'd need to barter your last turnip for a bundle. You notice a small clay pot by the hearth, empty of kindling, and feel the weight of their choice's warmth versus safety, both in short supply. You think of modern fireplaces, all cozy and controlled, and almost laugh this is survival roulette. You're impressed by their caution but also daunted. Every decision here is a tightrope walk. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like choosing between a space heater and not blowing a fuse. Joke number 2. If peasants had fire alarms, they'd still sleep closer to the pig than the hearth. The hut's chill bites deeper, but there's a story in this cold ash, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's frigid hut, the cold hearth sash a stark reminder of the fireless winter. The pig's faint snuffling blending with the wind rattling the Waterland daub walls. Your tunic stamped from the straw palais's musty embrace, and you're here to sip meager soups, the warming broths peasants brewed to stave off the cold's grip. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasants relied on thin, vegetable-based pottages, often just boiled roots, grains, or weeds to provide warmth and sustenance when food was scarce in winter. You're crouched by the cold hearth where Edith is stirring a clay pot over a tiny, precious flame, the first you've seen. Fed by a few sticks bartered at great cost. The air smells of watery turnips and faint herbs. and your stomach growls as you clutch the basket of foraged nettles from the frozen field, hoping they'll add some flavor. Edith ladles a grayish broth into a wooden bowl, its steam a fleeting promise of warmth. You take a sip, and it's bland, like hot water with a grudge, but it soothes your chilled core. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants added charred bones to their pottage, believing the smoky flavor strengthened the spirit against winter's gloom. You imagine tossing a bone in and hoping for a miracle, and you smirk. Tastes like desperation to me. Historians still argue whether these broths were nutritionally sufficient or barely enough to prevent starvation, with some saying they provided key vitamins, while others think they were more placebo than sustenance. You're leaning toward placebo. This soup's so thin you're still hungry, but your hands are less numb. You pass the bowl to Alice, who sips slowly, savoring every drop. You glance at the pot. Its contents barely enough for the family of 5. The flame beneath is pitiful, and you recall the hearth's usual coldness, firewood's too scarce to burn for long, even for cooking. You think back to the communal pallet, where body heat was the main defense, and see this broth as another small weapon against the cold. Edith sprinkles in a pinch of dried thyme, a rare treasure, and the scent lifts your spirits, if not your body temperature. You're impressed by her ability to make something from nothing, but the stakes are high. A bad batch or no food at all could weaken the family, leaving them vulnerable to illness. You try stirring the pot, but Edith shoos you away. She's the chef here, and you're just a guest. Joke number 1. If this pottage was on a menu, it'd be called OD turnip, with a hint of sadness. You huddle closer to the flame, its flicker a rare luxury, and notice Tom eyeing the pot like it's a feast. The family's resilience is humbling, but you're not loving the broth's aftertaste. Like chewing a wet leaf. You think of modern soups, creamy chowders, spicy ramen, and almost laugh. This is survival cuisine, no frills. You're starting to see why every sip matters, why they guard their herbs like gold. You smirk, imagining a modern equivalent, like microwaving instant noodles during a power outage and calling it gourmet. The hut's chill lingers, but the broth's faint warmth is a lifeline, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's icy hut, the faint warmth of Edith's watery pottage fading fast in your belly. The cold hearth now just a smoldering pile of ash as the pig snuffles lazily in the corner. Your damp tunic clings to you like a bad mood, and you're here to share the hut with livestock, whose body heat becomes a surprising ally against winter's chill. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasants often kept animals like pigs, goats, or chickens inside their homes during winter, not just for protection but to harness their warmth in the absence of fires. You're scooting closer to the pig, its bristly bulk radiating a musty heat, and wondering if you can ignore the smell for a chance at feeling your toes again. The hut's air is thick with straw, dust, and animal funk, but the family seems unbothered, curled on the pallet nearby. You nudge the pig, which grunts and shifts, its warmth seeping through your threadbare cloak. It's not cozy, but it's better than the drafty walls letting in snowflakes. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed animals' breath purified the hut's air, warding off winter miasmas thought to cause illness. You sniff the pig's sour exhale and smirk. Purified my foot. Historians still argue whether keeping livestock indoors was mainly for warmth or a mix of practical and superstitious reasons, like protecting valuable animals from thieves or cold. You're leaning toward warmth. This pig's like a living radiator, and you're not complaining, even if it's hogging the straw. You pat its flank, half expecting it to demand rent. You glance at Alice, who's tossing extra straw around the pig to trap its heat. her hands moving with practiced ease. You think back to the pottage's fleeting comfort, how every small trick broth palate. Now Pig builds a fragile defense against the cold. The hut's flimsy walls, those waterland daub sieves, make this animal's warmth a necessity, not a choice. You notice a chicken clucking in another corner, its feathers fluffed against the chill, adding a tiny bit more heat. The stakes are high. Without these animals, the family's fight against frostbite gets harder, and losing livestock to cold could mean starvation by spring. You try scooting closer to the pig, but it snorts, and you back off. Okay. Personal space, got it. Joke number 1. If this pig was a roommate, it'd leave dishes in the sink but pay rent in BTS. You look at Edith, who's checking the chicken for eggs, her fingers red from the cold. The family's survival hinges on these creatures, not just for warmth but for food, and you're impressed by their resourcefulness. You think of modern heating radiators, space heaters, and almost laugh. This is medieval ingenuity, raw and reeking. You're starting to see why they let animals bunk inside, why every grunt and cluck is a lifeline. You smirk, imagining a modern equivalent, like cramming your pets into bed during a polar vortex and calling it eco-friendly. Joke number 2. If peasants had TikTok, they'd post pig cuddle vids with #winterhack and go viral. The hut's chill bites, but the pig's warmth is a faint shield, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's freezing hut. The pig's musty warmth a faint comfort against the cold that seeps through the waterland daub walls, the chicken's soft clucks mixing with the wind's low moan outside. Your tunic stiff with damp straw, and you're here to patch these drafty walls with mud and straw. The makeshift insulation medieval peasants used to survive winter's bite. Mainstream history tells us peasants often reinforced their flimsy huts with whatever they could scrounge: mud, straw, even dung to block icy drafts and trap what little heat they had, whether from bodies or livestock. You're kneeling beside Alice, your hands smeared with sticky mud as you slap it onto a cracked wall, stuffing straw into gaps like you're caulking a ship. The air smells of wet earth and animal funk, and your fingers are numb. But the work's oddly satisfying, like a gritty DIY project. You grab a handful of straw from a pile by the door, mixing it with mud from a wooden bucket Edith filled earlier. The paste is cold and lumpy, but Alice shows you how to press it into the wall's cracks, sealing out the snow-flecked wind. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed adding a sprig of holly to the mud mix warded off ice spirits, giving their walls a touch of superstitious flair. You imagine Alice tucking holly in and muttering a charm, and you smirk cute. But you'll stick to mud. Historians still argue whether these repairs were purely practical or laced with ritual, a way to feel control over a merciless season. You're leaning toward practical. This mud's no magic bullet, but it's keeping the draft from whizzing down your neck. You pat the wall, and a clump falls off. Okay. Maybe you're not a master mason yet. You think back to the pig's heat, a lifeline in this unheated hut, and realize this wall patching is another layer in the peasant's survival strategy, like the pottage or communal pallet. The stakes are high. A poorly sealed hut could let in enough cold to sicken the family, and there's no medieval hardware store for backup. You notice John, Alice's father, checking the thatched roof for leaks, his hands as muddy as yours. The family's teamwork is quiet but fierce, everyone pitching in to fortify their fragile shelter. You recall the Lord's stone-walled manor, probably snug as a bug, and feel a twinge of resentment. This mud's all you've got. You keep slapping it on, your hands stinging, and wonder how they do this without dreaming of central heating. Joke number 1. If this wall was a resume, it'd list draft blocking under skills but flunk the interview. You step back, admiring the patchy wall, which looks like a toddler's art project but feels sturdier. Edith hands you a rag to wipe your hands, her own knuckles cracked from the cold. You're impressed by their resourcefulness, but the chill still bites through your tunic. A reminder that insulation here is a bandage, not a cure. You think of modern homes' foam insulation, double-glazed windows, and almost laugh. This is survival carpentry, medieval style. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like duct taping a drafty apartment window and calling it rustic. The hut's air softens slightly, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's chilly hut, your hands still caked with dried mud from patching the walls. The pig's faint warmth and the newly sealed cracks offering a sliver of relief from the biting cold. The air smells of damp straw and faint wood smoke from a neighbor's rare fire, and you're here to hear stories by candlelight. Tales peasants told to distract from winter's harsh grip. Mainstream history tells us medieval peasants relied on oral storytelling during long winter nights, sharing legends, folk tales, and local gossip to lift spirits and pass the time in dark, fireless huts. You're huddled on the straw pallet with Alice's family, a single tallow candle flickering on a wooden stool, casting jittery shadows as John, Alice's father, spins a tale about a clever fox outwitting a wolf. The hut's quieter now, the winds howl muffled by your muddy repairs, but the cold still nips at your fingers as you pull your patched cloak tighter. John's voice is low and rhythmic, describing the fox's tricks with a glint in his eye, and the family leans in, even little Tom, usually snoring, hanging on every word. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed telling stories about animals kept real beasts, like wolves from prowling too close, as if the tales wove a protective charm. You glance at the pig, snuffling in its corner, and smirk hope. It's listening. Historians still argue whether storytelling was mainly for morale or a deeper cultural ritual, preserving community bonds and wisdom. You're leaning toward morale. John's foxtail is making the hut feel less like an icebox, even if your toes are still numb. You try adding a line to the story, something about the fox stealing cheese, but Alice shushes you, her grin saying, "You're no bard." You think back to the pottage's fleeting warmth, the pig's heat, the mud-packed walls, all small defenses against winter, and now this candlelit tale is another, warming the mind if not the body. The candle's flame sputters, its tallow stench sharp, but it's a luxury, probably bartered for a week's worth of turnips. You're impressed by the family's ability to find comfort in words, to carve joy from darkness. The stakes are high. Without these stories, the endless cold could crush their spirits, leaving them as brittle as the frozen fields you foraged. You recall the Lord's manor, likely echoing with minstrels' songs, and feel a pang. This hut's tales are homespun but fierce. You lean closer to the candle, its glow hypnotic, and wonder how many nights they've survived on stories alone. Joke number 1. If this tale was a podcast, it'd be called Fox Drama. Medieval Unraveled. You notice Edith, her hands folded, smiling as John mimics the wolf's growl, and Tom giggles, his breath clouding the air. The family's closeness, forged on that cramped pallet, shines here, their laughter a shield against despair. You think of modern distractions, Netflix marathons, cozy reading nooks, and almost laugh. This is raw, human connection, medieval style. You're starting to see why stories mattered, why they were as vital as food or heat. You smirk, imagining a modern equivalent, like telling ghost stories during a blackout to keep the kids calm. The hut's chill lingers, But the tales, warmth is a soft bomb, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's drafty hut, the candles flickering low, fading as John's foxtail lingers in the air, the pigs snuffling, and the family's soft breaths mixing with the wind's faint moan outside. Your mud-caked hands are tucked under your patched cloak, and you're here to barter for blankets, those rare woolen covers that could mean the difference between shivering and surviving a medieval winter. Mainstream history tells us that wool blankets were scarce for peasants, often costing more than a season's labor, so they traded whatever they had: grain, tools, even labor for a chance at extra warmth. You're trudging out of the hut, with Alice clutching a small sack of barley from last fall's meager harvest, headed to a neighbor's hut where a weaver, old Meg, might have a blanket to spare. The snow crunches under your boots, and the village is a dark huddle of huts, the cold so sharp it feels like knives on your cheeks. You knock on Meg's door, and she ushers you into her hut, warmer than Alice's thanks to a tiny fire air. But Meg's got connections. Her loom sits in the corner, strung with coarse wool, and a single blanket, gray and scratchy, hangs on a peg. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed a blanket woven under a full moon held extra warmth, as if lunar magic could fend off frost. You glance at the sky, no moon tonight, and smirk, guess this blanket's just wool. Historians still argue whether bartering for blankets was a strategic choice or a last resort, with some saying peasants prioritized food over warmth, while others think textiles were valued as heirlooms. You're leaning toward last resort. That barley sack is Alice's family's buffer against starvation, but the cold's brutal. You offer it to Meg, who squints, weighing the deal. You think back to the candlelit stories, how they warmed the spirit, and the pig's heat, a gritty lifeline. This blanket's another piece of the survival puzzle, but the cost feels steep. Meg counters, asking for 2 sacks, and Alice hesitates, her face tight. You're impressed by her haggling skills. She's young but fierce, but you feel the stakes. No blanket means another night on that icy pallet, risking frostbite. You recall the Lord's manor, probably stuffed with furs, and grit your teeth. This barter's a peasant's only shot. You try sweetening the deal, offering to mend Meg's fence, but she's unmoved. Your hands are still muddy from wall patching, and you're tempted to fling some at her loom. Joke number 1. If this was a flea market, Meg'd be the vendor. Who'd trade your soul for a used scarf? You watch Ali's hand over the barley, her jaw set as Meg passes the blanket. It's rough, heavy with the smell of lanolin, but it's a treasure, something to wrap around Tom's shivering frame. You're starting to see why blankets were so prized, why every trade was a gamble with winter's wrath. You think of modern bedding, fluffy duvets, heated throws, and almost laugh. This is medieval luxury, hard-won and scratchy. You're impressed by Alice's resolve, but the loss of that barley stings. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like trading your laptop for a space heater during a freeze. The village's chill wraps around you, but the blanket's weight is a faint promise, and you're ready to keep going. You're trudging back to Alice's hut through the snow-crusted village, the heavy wool blanket from old Meg slung over your shoulder, its lanolin scent mixing with the sharp bite of winter air. The barley sack's absence weighs on you as much as the blanket's bulk, and you're here to pray for strength in the freezing village church, where medieval peasants sought faith to endure winter's trials. Mainstream history tells us that religion was a cornerstone for peasants, with church services and prayers offering hope and community when the cold threatened to break them. You're following Alice into the stone church, its walls damp and icy, the faint glow of tallow candles barely cutting the gloom. Your boots echo on the flagstones, and the air smells of wax and mildew. But the huddled villagers kneeling at the altar radiate a quiet resolve that warms you more than the blanket. You kneel beside Ali's, your patched cloak dragging on the cold floor, and join the murmured Latin prayer led by a shivering priest in a threadbare robe. His words promise divine protection, a shield against frost and famine. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed praying with a pebble in their shoe pleased God, making their pleas for warmth more likely to be answered. You slip a small stone into your boot, wincing as it digs in, and smirk divine or not. It's keeping you awake. Historians still argue whether faith was a genuine comfort or a coping mechanism, with some saying it gave peasants resilience, while others think it was a way to accept suffering as God's will. You're leaning toward comfort. The prayer's cadence, even if you don't catch every word, steadies your chattering teeth. You think back to the blanket's costly barter, the pig's heat, the pottage's thin warmth, all fragile defenses against winter, and now faith is another, binding the village in shared hope. The church is freezing, its windows unglazed, letting in gusts of snow. But the villagers' bowed heads don't waver. You're impressed by their devotion, but your knees ache on the stone, and you're tempted to sneak that pebble out. The stakes are high. Without hope, the endless cold could sap their will to fight another day. You recall the Lord's chapel, probably snug with tapestries, and feel a flicker of resentment. This church offers no heat, only heart. You glance at Ali's, her hands clasped, eyes closed, and wonder if she's praying for spring or just one warm night. Joke number 1. If this church had a suggestion box, install a fireplace would top the list. You shift, the pebble jabbing your foot, and notice Edith whispering her own prayer, maybe for Tom's cough to ease. The community here is a lifeline, like the communal pallet, and faith seems to knit it tighter. You think of modern comforts, heated pews, cozy prayer rooms, and almost laugh. This is raw, frostbitten worship. You're starting to see why they gather here, why prayers are as vital as blankets or broth. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like live streaming a meditation session during a blizzard for vibes. The church's chill seeps in, but the prayer's rhythm is a faint balm, and you're ready to keep going. You're back in Alice's hut, the church's cold prayers still echoing in your mind. The wool blanket from old Meg now draped over the straw pallet, its faint warmth a small victory against the frost. The pig's snuffling mixes with the wind's low howl, and you're here to discover the unique survival tactics of female peasants, whose winter coping tricks often went unnoticed but were vital to their family's endurance. Mainstream history tells us women in medieval villages, like Edith and Ali's, took on critical roles in winter, managing meager resources and using ingenuity to stretch food, warmth, and morale through the darkest months. You're sitting with Edith by the cold hearth, watching her unravel a worn tunic to repurpose its threads, her fingers deft despite the chill. The air smells of damp straw and faint tallow from a stubby candle, and you're wrapped in your patched cloak, marveling at her quiet resourcefulness. Edith shows you how to twist the tunic's threads into a thin cord, which she'll use to mend cloaks or tie straw for insulation. She explains that women often saved every scrap cloth, bone, even hair to bolster the hut or feed the family. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women tucked warmed stones under their skirts, believing the heat balanced the humors and kept them strong for winter chores. You imagine Edith slipping a hot rock into her apron and smirk, medieval pocket warmer. Anyone? Historians still argue whether women's tactics were a distinct survival strategy, or just part of the broader peasant grind, with some saying their domestic skills were key. while others think men and women shared the same desperate measures. You're leaning toward distinct. Edith's cord twisting feels like a woman's craft, born from years of making do. You think back to the church's prayers, how faith knit the village together, and see Edith's work as another thread in that web, less visible but just as strong. You try twisting a cord yourself, but your fingers fumble, and the thread snaps. Edith chuckles, handing you another scrap, and you're struck by her patience. Honed by winters of scarcity, the stakes are high. Without her tricks repurposing clothes, rationing pottage, soothing Tom's cough, the family could falter. You recall the pig's heat, the mud-packed walls, and realize women like Edith were the backbone, turning scraps into survival. You notice Allie's grinding dried nettles from the field into a paste, another of her mother's lessons to thicken broth. It's gritty work, but you're impressed by their resourcefulness, a quiet rebellion against the cold. You lean closer to the candle, its flicker casting shadows on Edith's worn hands. The hut's chill is relentless, but her steady rhythm twist, not repeat, feels like defiance. You think of modern multitasking moms, juggling budgets and meals, and almost laugh. This is medieval supermom mode. No coffee required. You're starting to see why women's tactics were crucial, why their small acts held the hut together. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like MacGyvering a heater from duct tape and a hairdryer during a freeze. The candle's glow softens, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's hut, the faint glow of the tallow candle casting soft shadows as Edith's cord-twisting hands slow, the pig snuffling, and the wool blanket's scratchy weight on the pallet grounding you in this frigid world. Your cloak's damp from the church's chill, and you're here to cling to the promise of spring, the hope that kept medieval peasants pushing through winter's darkest days. Mainstream history tells us that peasants endured winter by fixing their eyes on spring's arrival, when fields would thaw, crops could grow, and the cold's grip would loosen, offering a mental lifeline when physical warmth was scarce. You're sitting cross-legged on the straw, listening to Allie's whisper about the first green shoots she'll hunt come March, her voice soft but fierce with longing. The air smells of musty wool and faint nettles, and the wind's howl outside feels less cruel, as if spring's whisper is already softening its edge. Alice pulls a small, dried flower from her apron, a wilted relic from last summer, and holds it like a talisman, saying it reminds her of warmer days. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants tied such flowers to their doorposts, believing they called spring faster, a bit of folk magic to nudge the seasons along. You imagine Alice hanging this flower, and wishing for a time lapse, and you smirk cute, but you're skeptical. Historians still argue whether this hope for spring was a practical motivator, or a desperate fantasy, with some saying it drove peasants to ration food wisely, while others think it was a delusion to mask starvation's reality. You're leaning toward motivator. Alice's eyes, fixed on that flower, burn with a grit that's kept her family alive. You touch the flower, its brittle petals crumbling, and feel a pang of their fragile optimism. You think back to Edith's clever thread twisting, the pig's heat, the church's prayers, all pieces of a survival mosaic. And now hope is the glue binding them to a future beyond the snow. The stakes are high. Without this dream of spring, the endless cold could sap their will, turning resilience into despair. You glance at Tom, curled under the blanket, his cough quieter tonight, and wonder if he dreams of green fields too. You recall the Lord's manor, probably stocked for months, and feel a twinge of bitterness. Peasants bet on hope, not granaries. You try picturing spring, but the hut's chill pulls you back. your breath clouding the air. You're impressed by Alice's faith in something as distant as March, but you're not sure you'd bet on it yourself. Joke number 1. If hope was a medieval app, it'd be called Spring Tracker. Pray for thaw. You lean closer to the candle, its flame steady. Despite the drafts, Edith hums a soft tune about planting season, and the family's quiet optimism wraps you like a second blanket. You think of modern comforts, weather apps, heated homes, and almost laugh. This is raw, stubborn belief, medieval style. You're starting to see why hope was their anchor, why they clung to dried flowers and whispered of green. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like checking a forecast for sun during a blizzard and feeling briefly invincible. The hut's chill softens, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in Alice's hut. The tallow candle's glow nearly gone, its faint light dancing on the wool blanket and the dried flower Alice clutches, the pigs snuffling a soft rhythm against the wind's fading howl. Your mud-streaked cloak feels heavier, but you're here to reflect on the resilience of medieval peasants, how their winter survival leaves a legacy as spring's promise dawns. Mainstream history tells us peasants' endurance through brutal winters using body heat, meager broths, and sheer grit shaped rural communities. Their ingenuity passing down through generations, even as their hardships faded into folklore. You're perched on the straw pallet, the family's breath steady around you, and outside, the snow feels less oppressive, as if the earth is stirring beneath its frozen crust. The air smells of damp wool and faint hope, and you're holding the flowers' crumbling petals, feeling the weight of their triumph. You look at Alice, her face softened by sleep, the flower tucked into her hand like a vow kept. Their survival through patched walls, shared warmth, and whispered tales is a quiet miracle, etched into every patched tunic and mended hut. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages held thaw feasts when spring arrived, burning old straw pallets to celebrate winter's end, a ritual to bury the cold. You imagine Alice tossing this pallet into a bonfire and grin party time, medieval style. Historians still argue whether peasants' resilience was born from necessity or a deeper cultural strength, with some saying it was pure survival, while others think it forged a communal spirit that outlasted their era. You're leaning toward both. This hut's scars and stories feel like a legacy of heart and hustle. You trace the blanket's rough weave, its barter a testament to their fight. You think back to Edith's thread twisting, the church's prayers, the pigs he teach a thread in a tapestry of endurance, woven with hope for spring. The stakes were high. Every winter survived was a victory, a story to tell Tom's children. You recall the Lord's manor, its fires a distant taunt, and marvel at how peasants built warmth from nothing. The hut's chill is softer now, the wind quieter, as if spring's whispering closer. You're impressed by their legacy, not just in surviving but in shaping a world where community trumped cold. You wonder if Alice's flower will bloom again, a small defiance against winter's memory. Joke number 1. If peasants had a motto, it'd be freeze now, feast later maybe. You lean back, the palais's straw less pokey, the family's warmth the final gift. Their resilience lingers in the hut's patched walls, the blanket's weight, the flowers' dust a legacy that outlives the frost. You think of modern grit neighbors helping after storms, families sharing during crises, and see echoes of this village. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like posting "We beat the blackout" with a candlelit selfie. The candle sputters out, and you're ready to let this world drift, its lessons as enduring as spring's first green. Wind down, you're resting now, the hut fading into a gentle blur, the pig's snuffle softening to a whisper. The cold The patched walls, the hope for spring they dissolve, leaving only the rustle of straw and the calm of a warming world. You're safe here, wrapped in the quiet of a village that fought and won, its resilience glowing like embers in your mind. Let your breathing slow, each exhale long and easy, your body sinking into the palais's embrace. The stories of Alice, Edith, and their flower linger, but they're distant now, blending into the dawn's soft light. You don't need to hold them. The hut's chill fades, the air grows still, and you're drifting, carried by a peace as steady as spring's return. Sleep's waiting, gentle and sure, ready to cradle you like a peasant's hope. Close your eyes, let go, and rest.